Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration. In this episode, we're going to continue a topic started in Season 3, Episode 6, Villains and Alignment. In fact, the most common question I get is how to write a good villain. That Season 3 episode dealt with creating your main villain, which should be a mirror to your players, an opportunity for them to see how the world works, and how their alignment can affect things. A preview of what evil is capable of, what should happen if the hero should fail. However, over the course of a D&D campaign, your players are going to face a lot of villains, a lot of different challenges, and to avoid a Saturday morning kids cartoon feel, we want to make sure they actually have villains to defeat along the way to that final bad guy. While it may work in an episodic format, your players expect results when they defeat a bad guy. These adventures do not end with us locking up Joker in Arkham again, only to see him reappear the following week. The players have had their lives threatened so many times leading up to a boss battle that it is extremely unlikely they're going to be non-lethal about it. Or at the very least, they're not going to agree on the amount of lethality they should have. This was highlighted quite well in Avengers Endgame, where Thor jumps the gun a little bit, a pretty common move for the barbarian or melee DPS of the group. In order to satisfy your players' need for destruction and conclusion, you're going to need a whole cast of villains along the way to that final big bad. And even at that point, you may choose that there is a big bad to the big bad, a master that was controlling your original villain, maybe a dark god who is orchestrating things behind the curtain. The easiest way to go about creating your tiers of villains is not to go applying attributes like you might to townsfolk or NPCs they meet in a city. And it's not to go about creating a rogues gallery, though that will ensure there's different themes for your villains and they can pose different types of challenges, or at the least have different minions, which at least showcase some different monster types. The easiest way to diversify your villains is to make an alignment spectrum, a villain spectrum, leading from good to evil. Make a large line on a piece of paper, write lawful good at the top, and all the way at the bottom, write chaotic evil. Then create villains that fill it out. And maybe villain isn't the right word here, it puts us in a confined brain space. Maybe we should say NPCs of challenge. Either way, by figuring out where your NPCs land on alignment, we can start to understand their motivations. And then later on, we can apply a Scottish accent, cocky or smug attributes. Make them mysterious. Make them smart or dumb. And every time you write a name at the bottom of the list, down there by chaotic evil, make sure you add a name to the top of the list. And there are absolutely lawful good villains. We see these all the time in monster and kaiju movies. Sometimes they appear in comic book movies. In particular, they take the form of the military, the American military. They are going to nuke the city unless the kaiju is stopped. So the heroes must race to defeat the monster and save the entirety of New York City. In the middle section of Iron Man 2008, Tony Stark is fighting jets sent by the Air Force. They're not evil. They are trying to kill Tony Stark. They don't know he's Iron Man at the time. So this is a temporary villain. I don't think I'd call it a classic, but in the 1996 film The Rock, starring Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery, Nicolas Cage's character Stanley Goodsby must disarm the rockets facing San Francisco, presented by one villain, before the island is blown up by the military, who is presenting a second challenge. Most villains on the lawful good side of the spectrum are going to take the form of order. They understand the sacrifices that must be made. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so they are forced to dark action in order to mitigate the losses. This could be a zealous judge, a paladin who's taken things too far. You could have an order of angels who want to destroy the characters because they're messing with time itself. The cosmos is out of balance because they defeated that dark god. You might have a warlock in the party, and even though they're performing good deeds in principle, their very existence is an affront to the paladin order. On the other side of the spectrum, of course we have things like the Joker, an embodiment of chaos. But going beyond that, we have the cosmic evils, otherworldly beings who by their very nature are not conducive to a mortal existence. These are things like Cthulhu, or the Reapers from Mass Effect. One could say they're just doing their thing, making people insane with their very existence, harvesting biomass to create more of themselves. To them, they're just raking the leaves, taking out the trash, getting some souls to sustain themselves. Everybody has to eat after all. Otherworldly villains can also exist in the middle of the spectrum. Things like G-Man from the Half-Life series, or even the Happy Mask Salesman from Majora's Mask. Are they evil? They're certainly weird. They're certainly odd. They're certainly creepy. But they have their own goals and motivations. They want to see the world changed. And while these two have selected a champion, Gordon Freeman and Link respectively, they have nonetheless posed challenges to that player. They have made their lives more difficult, much as a villain would. But continue to challenge yourself as you move through this exercise. It is very easy to lump everyone who is an antagonist in the evil category. Just because they oppose the heroes or are hostile to them doesn't mean they have to be evil, or at the very least, they could be someone else's hero. Think of Dolores Umbridge from Harry Potter. That character would not come to pass if we just set about making an evil teacher. Instead, Dolores Umbridge is a lot easier to create if we think of her as lawful good. She is someone else's hero, in this case, the Ministry of Magics. She is working in absolute accordance with the Ministry's new rules. What makes her evil and villainous is that she relishes in those opportunities to enact order. To force Harry Potter into writing, "I must not tell lies," on the back of his own hand. Same goes for Saren in the Mass Effect series. In his mind, he is doing what is best for the Council. He discovered the Reapers and allied with them in order to save the universe, at a point, eventually falling to evil. So up here, by good, we can write things like someone else's hero, or an authority. But we can also have accidental villains. And these character archetypes are very popular in zombie pop culture, movies, comic books. People like Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead, or Joel Miller from The Last of Us. They are villains. They're constantly performing heinous acts in the pursuit of their own survival. In their case, the needs of the many are outweighed by the needs of the one. Joel destroys an entire operation, the Fireflies, in order to save one person. And that one person could have led to the end of a zombie apocalypse. We also see a lot of accidental villains in sitcoms, like Ross Geller from Friends. Through his ridiculous desires, through his own ineptitude, he is constantly troubling the other friends in the group, causing shenanigans and ultimately villainous problems. It's kind of fun to watch Friends and imagine Ross as the villain. We could also say someone like Louise Belcher from Bob's Burgers is a villain. She is constantly complicating the stories. Maybe a minor antagonist, but spurred on by her own desires. Where would you put a sympathetic villain? Someone like Batman's Mr. Freeze. He's trying to save his wife Nora. What about Sandor Clegane from Game of Thrones? Or Zuko from Avatar? It is very easy to list them because of their chaotic nature in the chaotic evil category. But what if instead we thought of them as chaotic good villains? Doesn't that spark more interest for you as the writer of this campaign? Make you want to explore them more? This is where you start to get into the idea of anti-villains. Villains who have good intentions, but aren't going about it in a good way. Thanos from Avengers is certainly a case of this. Ultimately, he wants peace in the galaxy. Food and space enough for everyone. However, his plan to put together the Infinity Gauntlet and destroy half of life isn't a very good plan. Or at least a good aligned plan. I've read plenty of articles that have argued that the plan wouldn't work at all, but that's a different story, and this is a fantasy. However, anti-villains and anti-heroes are not to be confused with morally gray, which is extremely difficult to write. A morally gray villain is not doing something good or completely evil. Their moral grayness is more supported by the overall trappings of the story. For instance, World of Warcraft has self-proclaimed morally gray characters, and this works because the game is divided into two factions, and both have to have good and evil aspects. Players want to have to play both the Horde and the Alliance. Therefore, their leaders have become morally gray by necessity, presenting both a good and evil side to everything they do. An isolated, condensed version of morally gray, which we would want to call on this list chaotic neutral, is more like what we saw in Age of Ultron from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Ultron is a child. He's exploring the world and he has desires for himself. He wants to create an awesome body and take over the job that Tony Stark had assigned him in his own way. If Ultron succeeded, he may lead to a very peaceful universe. But this went beyond the ideas that Tony Stark had created him for. In fact, let's go ahead and label Tony Stark as the accidental villain of Age of Ultron. If you do want to go about creating a morally gray villain, it is way easier to start with a faction, or a corporation, an organization. Things like Weyland-Yutani from the Aliens movies. On the surface, they're building colonies on other planets, operating mining industries. They may have a bioweapons department. We could also say that Cerberus, from the Mass Effect series, is a morally gray organization until they get completely taken over by the Reapers. You might include things like the Knights Templar or the Illuminati, the Freemasons. They are all capable of being antagonists, though not exactly evil or good. There are absolutely evil organizations like the Empire from Star Wars or Hydra, but those would require their own villain spectrums. We've got believers and enforcers like the Emperor and Vader, down all the way to punch clock villains, people who are on the job like the Stormtroopers, who make their own individual decisions, sometimes defect. A group like Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants from the X-Men series really can't decide which side of the spectrum they're on. We would divide up each character into their own list. And from that, we create the overall organization. Now with our villains divided up in a way that pushes your imagination, gets you to think differently beyond the cackling and the monologuing and the He-Man Skeletoring that you may have done before, we can start seeing some really unique villains and highlight how they're different to the players. With that exercise done, now move in and add those attributes. The accents you know how to do. Is the character a mastermind type? A mustache twirler? Are they likable but still villainous? Are they wacky? Are they an equal, an old friend? Do they have a fatal flaw like Two-Face or the Riddler? Or do they just embody a theme you would enjoy? Like the Toymaker, the Mad Hatter, Penguin, who has penguins. Are they a spy? Are you planning a betrayal? Layer those things in, but keep their goals in mind. That's what makes them different from each other. But we have one more important thing to talk about before this episode ends. A group of villains that is not part of our alignment spectrum here. And that is forces of nature, the beast, the machine, uncaring predators who don't really need alignment to do their job. Forces of nature or Mother Nature can be things like tornadoes. In the 1996 film Twister, the villain is a tornado. In fact, many different types of tornadoes, eventually leading to what is called in the film a finger of God. Because of the outrageousness that our primary villain is the weather, we have a secondary antagonist in the form of Dr. Jonas Miller, played by Cary Elwes. Forces of nature could also be asteroids, like the one in the 1998 film Armageddon. That entire movie is based around defeating a villain that is just a space rock. The beast category accounts for, well, animals. Things like dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, or the aliens from Aliens. Their motivations are primal. There's not a lot you're going to have to figure out. They want to feed and destroy. Each in their own unique way. That's what makes them interesting. And the machine isn't so different. Granted, Skynet is an extremely complicated machine in the Terminator series. It keeps adapting its goals, changing the timeline. But ultimately, its servants, the Terminators, are being sent in a very linear fashion. They are there to destroy anything in their path. The machine villain can be particularly terrifying because it is so calculating, so cold. Everything it does has purpose, but with no regard for life. HAL 9000 in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Some might argue Roy Bately from the 1982 film Blade Runner is a machine. We could also put Ultron, particularly in his early forms in that movie, as a machine. Becomes more complex, that's part of the character's growth. The final thing I want you to do in this exercise is now take this villain spectrum and try to tie it to your campaign monster list that we did in Season 6, Episode 3. Can you now apply these archetypes to the monsters you are planning to run in combat? Not only will this further diversify your monsters, it'll also help you decide when these villains are going to hit in your campaign. What order are they going to be presented in? And the big one for DMs, it keeps it in your mind that you're going to lose. to not get too tied to these villains because you have a lot of other fun ideas. Always be prepared for your villains to die. It is your gift to the players. And thank you for joining me for this episode of DM Gives Inspiration. Lots of exciting things happening as we wind down Season 7. Next week will be a history episode, and then we'll be into Episode 10, the second mailbag. Send your messages over at kylefergusson.com using the contact link at the bottom, or join the Discord, which you can find a link for there on that website. You could also message me directly on Twitter if you choose. You should also check out this weekend's There Will Be Dungeons on the Frog Pants Network, as I am taking over the DM role for a season, about 12 episodes there. We are going to be playing a campaign based on lit RPGs that I've talked about in the past. Very much looking forward to that. Be sure to check it out. You can support the show over at patreon.com/KyleFergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith. And I will see you all next week with more inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons.